So thank you for all for coming and being here tonight. Aasif is going to start us off with a little passage from the book. I'm not sure that it needs a huge introduction. My narrator, who has my name and many of the facts of my life, which I think Jenny and I will discuss, the confusion there, is on a trip through Scranton. He's on a trip through Pennsylvania and gets pulled over because there's exhaust coming out of his car, and he has an encounter with a state trooper, and Aasif is going to read that.
A decade ago, while driving back to Harlem from upstate New York, where I'd spent the weekend with my parents at the Finger Lakes resort they visited every few years, an excursion memorable not only because it was then my father announced I'd been conceived on the resort's second floor in a room on the lakeside. He couldn't remember any longer exactly which one, but also because it was the last time I would see my mother before she was diagnosed with the recurrence of the cancer that would eventually take her life. It was while driving back along I-81 that my Saab 900's exhaust started sending out white smoke, or so a Pennsylvania state trooper would inform me once he pulled me over to ask if my engine had overheated. That was when I first noticed that the needle of the car's temperature gauge was pointing in the wrong direction. We popped open the hood to take a look inside, and foul-smelling steam nearly singed our faces. He laughed as he pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his cheeks and forehead. I wiped mine on my sleeve. The trooper's earlier approach to the car had put me at ease. His slow, deliberate movements, his measured, cheery tone, intended, I thought, to announce he was just there to help. And his reaction now only reinforced the message. He was bone white, his features boyish, though there was something ancient about his vaulted cheekbones and the Tartar slant to his eyes. Polish or Serbian, I thought, though the last name on his tag betrayed no obvious ethnic origin. Matthew. As we stepped away from the car, he pointed ahead at an exit. We weren't far from Clark Summit, he said, where there was a garage. He suspected that was where AAA would take me, though he had to admit he'd only ever heard bad things about the service there. I know a garage in Scranton where I always go. It's a little further, but they'll come get you with their own truck. I know the owner. They do great work. I'd be happy to call them for you. It was a bright, mild day in late October. The surrounding hills were ablaze with autumn color. As Trooper Matthew and I waited for the tow truck, his cruiser between us and the traffic's noisy ebb and flow, he turned to me and asked, entirely benignly, I thought, where my name was from. I knew from experience that an honest answer to this not infrequent question could raise suspicions where there might otherwise have been none. My well-intentioned interlocutors suddenly beclouded by some reflexive evocation of terror. In the trying months after 9/11, when the simple act of mounting the city bus and paying my fare had become a provocation met with fearful watching glares, I'd settled on a prophylactic strategy. India, I would say. It was a lie. The name wasn't Indian, but I knew the question usually masked a curiosity about my origins, and as you already know, my parents were born in what was then India. The answer had the obvious advantage of connoting not the reference of terror, murder, and rage that most associated with Pakistan, but rather the bright colors and spicy tastes and delightful dishes like tikka masala, gyrating flash mobs in Bollywood movies, and yoga pants. To complicate all this further, my name is actually Egyptian, and depending on the political moment, in the wake of attacks like those on tourists at Luxor and Sharm el-Sheikh, or 2 years later during the misleading months of the so-called Arab Spring, mentioning Egypt can become a prompt to more questions, each riddled with a particular pitfall that often leads to the very sort of mistrust I am ever keen to avoid in the first place. If all this sounds somewhat paranoid, I'm happy for you. Clearly, you have not been beset by daily worries of being perceived and therefore treated as a foe of the Republic rather than a member of it. Standing alongside Officer Matthews, surrounded by the painted hills, grateful for his charitable interest in my vehicle's proper repair, disarmed my gratitude. I opted for the complicated truth. The name is Egyptian, I said. Really? My parents aren't from Egypt, but when my father first came to this country, he had an Egyptian friend who had my name. He'd never heard it before and really liked it. So when I was born, he used it for me. Funny thing is, he doesn't say it right, or at least not how he heard it said by his friend. How are you supposed to say it? I joked my way through the various pronunciations of my name. The original Arabic, which sounded nothing like how my parents said it, and which was different still from the way my kindergarten teacher had coined the American pronunciation, which had stuck ever since. So why couldn't your parents say it right? Well, they don't speak Arabic. They're not Arabs. Well, no, they're from Pakistan. So actually, they were born in India, but that's a long story. And you all moved here from Pakistan when you were in kindergarten. I was born here. He paused for a moment, picking lint off the stiff felt dome of his wide-brimmed trooper hat. From somewhere upwind of us, the sweet smell of burning applewood was pouring into the air. So where were you born? He asked, suddenly tentative. It was clear I made a mistake. Wisconsin, I said. It was another lie. Though I spent almost the entirety of my childhood and adolescence in Wisconsin, I was born on Staten Island. Wisconsin, though, felt like a stronger move in this negotiation around the impression forming inside him. Never been, he said. I just read this book, The Looming Tower. You heard of it? It won the Pulitzer last year, didn't it? Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I know the writer, Lawrence Wright. Great guy. I'd recently met Lawrence, or Larry, as he'd introduced himself, at a reading of a play he'd written about the Italian journalist Arianna Fallaci. We'd spoken afterwards, an encounter I doubt he would recall, and during which I would wonder if, in fact, his sympathies with Fallaci's troubling views on Islam were deeper than he was letting on in the play he'd written. In short, I was misrepresenting both my affection for and proximity to this famous writer in an obvious attempt to signal status and amiability to get Trooper Matthew off whatever suspicions I worried he was now harboring. He continued, you know, I never knew that the guy who ran the whole crew of hijackers was from Egypt. For some reason, I thought they were all from Iraq. I thought that's why we went to Iraq. See, but the truth is, none of them was from Iraq. Not a one. They was mostly from Saudi. And Mohammed Atta, the guy in charge, he was from Egypt, Cairo, actually. So quickly had we arrived via my father's best friend on the subject of Atta. My grandfather was stationed in Cairo during the World War. We had a picture of him in front of the pyramids. I used to dream about visiting when I grew up, standing there. My grandpa did. I had no idea the kind of hate they got for us. I bit my lip, literally, and nodded, hoping my silence would appear respectful. I gotta say, for guys who are pure evil, Trooper Matthew added, the book almost made me understand them. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I felt for them or anything like that. I mean, they're monsters, but you know, when you see what happens in their countries and how messed up everything is for them, how hard it is for folks who live there, when you start to get how they're seeing the world, you can understand how they start thinking Disneyland's really the problem with everything. Disneyland. Yeah, Atta, he hated Disneyland, thought America was turning the world into a theme park. Moments earlier, I hadn't known better than to speak. Now, I was certain silence was necessary. He was fishing, his tone no longer declarative, but slipping at the ends of phrases into the ostensible friendliness of the interrogative. I mean, you can almost understand a guy like that. You know what I mean? You think? I don't know. I do. I really do. He paused again and glanced at me. I thought, with a look that drew out more distinctly the tapering almond shape of his eyes. You know what? You know that when he returned his rental car on September 9th, he called the rental agency to tell them the oil light was on? You believe that? He didn't care about the 3,000 people they killed, but he cared about the next person driving the car. You believe that? I wouldn't if I saw it in a movie. The book sounds amazing, I said after a short pause. Right, he said distantly. I should probably get on the horn, make sure those guys are on their way. The hat found his head again as he walked back to the driver's side to make his call. He was still on the phone running a check on me, I assumed, when the flatbed truck from Marek Auto Repair pulled up. The tow driver was a short, stocky man in denim overalls whose face was covered with blistering acne. He huddled over the engine to inspect. Yeah. Busted head gasket. You guys can fix that, right? Shouldn't be a problem. I looked over the cruiser where Trooper Matthews' face was lowered, phone still to his ear. The tow driver backed up the truck and lowered the flatbed. Once the cables were attached, the truck's squealing winch pulled my car up into place. It wasn't until the car was mounted and level and until we got into the cab and were readying to go that Trooper Matthew finally emerged and made his way to the tow truck's driver's side window. He and the driver spoke about someone they both knew. I could tell he was ignoring me. I looked forward and did the same. As the conversation came to an end, the trooper put his hand on the door frame and leaned in. Staten Island, right? It took me a moment to realize he was addressing me. What's that? Staten Island. That's where you were born. Not Wisconsin. Isn't that right? He was staring at me now. His blank look less of provocation than an acknowledgement of betrayal. Whether his or mine, I couldn't tell. What to say, how to explain that I'd been worried he had the wrong idea about me, and I lied to let him know I was not the enemy he worried I might be. Was there really no way to convey this simple truth through the thicket of mistrust that had so quickly grown between us? If there was, I didn't see it. So I lied again. Oh, no, that's wrong. It's a long story. My response didn't seem to surprise him. You know, you can always get that taken care of. All you have to do is take your birth certificate in. It was never a problem for me before, sir, but thank you. I heard my combative tone. I hadn't intended it. He looked away, his tongue lodged against the inside of his feet, fighting, I thought, the urge to allow, even encourage, an escalation. Okay, he said, finally patting the door frame with his palm. Hope everything works out with the car. Have a good day. Thank you.
That was such a pleasure, and yet so painful. So in a way, hearing this aloud, it helped me to understand the scene even more than I did when I read it the first time. And it's this sort of beautiful dissection of interaction gone wrong. They begin as allies, the protagonist and Trooper Matthew. And Ayad, the protagonist, begins by being honest with him, but that seems to be not working. So then he tries fibbing, and that seems to be not working. So then he tries silence, and that isn't really working. So then he tries lying some more, and then he starts to feel combative, and it's a shit show. Talk a little bit about this dynamic, which you portray so beautifully.
I mean, I suppose, first of all, thanks for being here, Jenny. I suppose I'm dramatizing the process of microaggression, I guess. I mean, that's the term we now use for this sort of thing. You know, I think as Muslims in this country, or as brown people, you don't even have to be Muslim, after 9/11, if you were identifiably in any kind of vicinity, South Asian or Middle Eastern, whatever that meant, and sometimes even if you were Latinx, you would get mistaken for being Muslim, if you will. And that was enough of a reason to get certain kind of suspicious attention, right? And this is nothing new. We're 19 years. I keep getting the question about, just today, I did 2 radio interviews, and in both. So I read this book, and I guess you're trying to say that life's really hard for Muslims after 9/11. First of all, no. And second, this is 19 years ago. We're still talking about this. So, but I think what I'm doing in this section is I'm dramatizing the way that the process of being identified as something that you're concerned your interlocutor might take you to be, is to say that habituation of microaggression creates kind of all kinds of defensive strategies. And those defensive strategies speak to a certain psychology. And that psychology begins to form a kind of identity. And all of it is adrift from anything like authenticity. It's really just socially constructed behavior that then begins to take on its own center of gravity. And by the end of this chapter, this behavior, this psychological center of gravity has taken on such an amplitude that there's a pivotal epiphany that this narrator has, which then leads to a lot of what happens later in the book.
It seems like the two problems that are at work in what we just heard are obviously the trooper's suspicions, which are, quickly manifest, but also the self-consciousness of the narrator, a kind of internalized self-scrutiny that, oddly enough, sort of in the ultimate irony, and something that I think all of us can relate to, when you're most trying to be authentic, you come off as the phoniest.
Right.
I wonder if you could just speak to that particular phenomenon as it plays into this this larger phenomenon that you're talking about with microaggressions.
Well, I think in this particular instance, authenticity or being authentic is predicated on understanding a certain history. So it's impossible to perform or be simply authentic given all these reference if your partner in this exchange or your interlocutor does not know certain basic things about the history in which your authenticity is nested. And so the simple fact that, for example, at the core of this book is partition in India. The partition of India into two countries, well, eventually would become three countries, but at the time, two countries, Pakistan and India. And the fact that India was all one thing is the thing that so many people don't know, and that underlies the lives of so many South Asian immigrants in this country. And so you can't really perform or be authentic if if those who you're speaking to don't know anything about your history. They have their own reference, and you have to adapt in some way to the dominant majority's reference, and you have to account for them. And so, ideas and things like being a model minority or any number of sort of performative strategies that come from that underlying, they emanate from that fact. So I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but that's
you did, absolutely. And it's fascinating, the idea that a lack of knowledge about world history, which is something that Americans are famously guilty of. And I include myself in that, I have to say.
You're pretty good. You're pretty good.
It's very hard there's sort of there are no common points of reference. So the point of reference that you end up with, beyond the car, which is what begins the sort of the apparent allegiance at the beginning, the point of reference is this book. And Ayad, the protagonist, actually has met the writer, and the trooper has read the book, but that's not enough. And it all begins to sort of fall apart.
Right, because Egypt either means pyramids, like his grandfather standing in front of the pyramids, or it means this fascinating factoid that he just discovered, is that Muhammad Atta was Egyptian. He thought all those guys were from Iraq. Turns out they were from Saudi Arabia, and this guy was Egyptian. So that's the thing that, and I think, in fairness to Trooper Matthew, I feel like Trooper Matthew was trying to be open and helpful and interested, and then one thing leads to the next in this sort of narrow circle of historical reference post 9/11 in America mean that somebody like myself in the book has no choice but to find the cul-de-sac of these associations finds you out one way or the other.
So your protagonist, as you just said, myself, your protagonist has your name and some of your bio, which of course leads the reader to wonder at every turn, especially as things get wilder as the book goes on, which parts are true and which are invented. And I can imagine that at some points, and I felt as I was reading it, my curiosity about that question has got to be kind of the lowest common denominator of discourse about the book. Like, hey, did that really happen? And yet, of course, I felt that. And you are inviting the reader to ask those questions. So my question for you is, what are the literary advantages for you of inviting your readers to wonder what's true and what's not?
Well, thank you for that brilliantly articulated question. I don't think there are any literary advantages. It's clear to me that the literal reading that I am often encouraging in the book forecloses literary and metaphorical readings. And that's unfortunate for me. But it seemed to me there was something much more important than opening up a metaphorical dimension. You know, I call it a novel because it is a novel. So much of it is concocted. But it is a novel because I'm asking the reader to assess it on it with a different lens, with a different standard of truth, if you will. That I want them to assess what the book is saying about something much larger, like the United States and Donald Trump, the era that we are living in, finance and its grip on our national psyche. Those are the things that the book is really about. It's not about the merely anecdotal or the merely particular things that may or may not have happened to me. But it seemed to me, and I'm just speaking about myself, but in my hands, a straight third-person narrative or an obviously fictional narrator, I would not be able to do justice to the madness that has happened. It would read like satire. And it felt to me that the only real way to move away from, oh, this is a novel that it's not really speaking about what we're living through right now. The only way to pivot away from that was to pivot into memoir, was to lean into this trompe-l'oeil, if you will, this tricking of the eye, no pun intended, where the form of the book mirrors the collapse of fact and fiction into one another. I do believe that at its best, art can perform a kind of mimesis that reflects back or mirrors back our reality. And I think that I wanted to play with that confusion. And finally, the real reason, the real core reason, was because I wanted to write a philosophical novel that had the addictive thrill of reality TV, say. The breaking news notification, the absorption in the Instagram scroll. That something about the reader's, my attention, the reader's attention, has narrowed so much, become so intensely focused on the discrete piece of information, the discrete photograph, the discrete update, and alighting from thing to thing to thing with this same focus. I wanted to mirror that. I wanted to find a way into that. And it felt like playing this game with illusion and reality was a direct path into a kind of sensational prurience that was going to keep the reader alive. So all of these things are about ensnaring the reader's attention in order to have, I hope, a literary and philosophical exploration together. But I am aware that having used these tactics creates its own obstacle inside the experience itself.
You know, one thing that strikes me as you talk about reality TV and Instagram, so many of those forms are about are trying to satisfy a kind of hunger for authenticity that I think we feel kind of writ large in our culture, in the sense that it's true, it's happening right now. You're getting the kind of raw version of it, the sort of unmediated version. Right. And it makes me think of what we were just talking about, that self-consciousness that makes authenticity so difficult to achieve. I just wonder, does that spark any thoughts in you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way, there's a lot of anguish and anger, as well as hijinks and humor and seduction in the book. But there's a lot of anger, and I think part of that anger is all of the anger that's been stored away in me as an American and also as an artist, dealing with what feels like the difficulty of being authentic with an audience or in a culture that doesn't necessarily have the reference to, as I said earlier, situate that authenticity. And so, you know, as for example, let's say Disgraced, a play that I wrote, which won the Pulitzer, and I've often said, you know, I wouldn't have a career if people really understood what I was doing. I've been misinterpreted generously in so many instances and then awarded for it. And in a way, it's the Disgraced is in dialogue with my own community, the community that I come from. And it is also in dialogue with the non-Muslim community. But what it is suggesting and saying, it's impossible to understand if you don't get the context of where it arises from. It's one of the reasons that a lot of Muslim members in the audience, if they're not so angry with me that they don't want to talk to me, will say to me, well, we understand what you're doing, but why are you doing it in front of them? Because they're not going to understand. And those audience members are not wrong. They don't, the non-Muslim audiences tend not to understand. They like it for other reasons, and that's fine. But constantly being caught inside this, to some extent, it's the dilemma of the artist, right? I mean, I'm sure that you have some experience of that yourself, where you're writing something and it gets misapprehended, maybe even in a positive way, and you have to just live with that. But I think that in a way, some of the anger in the book is coming from that place of saying, well, I am authentic. I'm not performing myself, but I'm constantly being perceived as performing the good Muslim or performing the bad good Muslim. Like, it's really that I'm performing the bad good Muslim. That's the rap that I get. So anyway, yes, I think that's a germane. I think that's a deeply germane line of thinking with this.
It sounds from what you're saying like the fixation of some of your readers or interlocutors on the question of whether things are real or not has been more distracting than you anticipated. Is that true?
I don't know. I think I probably anticipated it. It's so fascinating. Somebody wrote a review. My assistant sent me a review that was on Goodreads, and somebody wrote this review and said something like, there is no Kamal Morse. There's a character that I talk about at one point, an NFL player who gives up his career in the NFL and then runs for city council in Kansas City. And so there is no Kamal Morse in the NFL, and then there's a Khalil Mack with the same initials, but he still plays for the NFL and he's a Christian. There is no this, there is no that. And he goes through it. He says, at this point in the book, I realized maybe this is all made up. And comes to the conclusion that probably only 20% of what's in the book is actually real. And then has this really thoughtful analysis of, if it's made up, what would the purpose of making all this stuff up be? And that begins the conversation. So I think that there are folks out there who are, and I think it's fine. I think at the end of the day, like I said, I wanted to bring front and center what had happened in the country. And I think that the book is able to do that. And the fact that people often think that it's all real and all true actually makes them listen differently than if they were reading a novel. And I will take that over the metaphorical and literary readings that, of course, I'm accustomed to wanting to build as a novelist, as a dramatist, as a storyteller.
I get it totally. It's a certain kind of focus, a kind of hyper vigilant focus that you are. Because I think it's always interesting to think about craft choices as a sort of cost-benefit analysis.
Totally. Yes.
What are you giving up and what are you getting? What you're giving up is, you have to have maybe more conversations than you want about whether you've ever had syphilis. But what you're getting is this kind of hyper-focus from the reader.
That's right. And I'm getting the opportunity to voice the real in direct language with the reader in an unusual way, where they are off kilter just enough to be listening a little bit differently, but still with enough of the other listening that they can hear the directness of what I'm saying.
Well, I think that is the perfect moment, now that you've talked about our listening, for you to do the next reading, and then we'll talk some more, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Great. So thank you. And the section I'm going to read is taken from the first chapter, in which my father, who in reality was a very famous cardiologist in the book, is also a very famous cardiologist, and as in reality was a famous doctor of many famous people. In the book is a doctor to Donald Trump in the mid-90s for a few years, and brings him into proximity with Trump, and gives him a kind of contact high that lasts almost 2 decades. And his enamorment with Donald Trump's way of life, what he represents and all of that, American opportunity writ large, and American individualism on debt, as we now know for certain because of the New York Times, anyway, so it means that this contact with Trump in the 90s leads to my father being a supporter of Donald Trump during the 2015-2016 election, which causes small degree of conflict between him and me in the book. And so on the day of the election in 2016, I figured tonight with the debate that we're all dreading just a few minutes from now, that it might be nice to read this section about that day in November in 2016. So my father and I get on a conversation. He's had a little too much to drink, and he won't tell me who he's voted for. He never would tell me how he voted, but the shame I heard in his voice was unmistakable. I think he was admitting to me that night, in the only way he could, that he'd done it. Despite knowing better, he'd voted for Donald Trump. I've wondered what he might have been thinking as he stepped into the all-purpose room in the quaint town hall of the suburban enclave where he lives, a room likely filled that day mostly with the whites he thought too concerned with their summer vacations. I've wondered, as he walked into that room and showed his ID and took his place in line, did he know yet? Or when he stepped into the voting machine, drew the curtain, and stared at the cleft column of names, what was he feeling? What moved him to lift his hand for the tiny lever on the red side and press down on it? I wondered if some part of him didn't really believe he was doing it, or believed it wouldn't matter, for wasn't it a foregone conclusion at that point that Hillary would win? And if he voted for Trump only because he really thought she would win, what was he trying to say? What private thought or feeling was he honoring? What fidelity did he not want to betray? I don't think it was misogyny. He loved Benazir Bhutto, was gutted by her killing. No, I think it was his enduring love of Trump. What was this attachment to the man? Was it really just the memory of the helicopter rides, the spacious suite, the hooker, a tailor's tape, a lapel pin? Could it really be so banal? Or were those things standing in for something else, something more encompassing and elusive? Father always called America the land of opportunity. Hardly original, I know. But I wonder, opportunity for whom? For him, right? The opportunity to become whatever he desired? Sure, others too, but only insofar as others really meant him. And wasn't that what Mary was saying all those years ago? And Mary's a mentor who talks about this at the opening of the book. And wasn't that what Mary was saying all those years ago, that our vaunted American dream, the dream of ourselves enhanced and enlarged, is the flag for which we are willing to sacrifice everything, gouging our neighbors, despoiling our nation, everything that is except ourselves? A dream that imagines the flourishing of others as nothing more than a road sign, the prick of envy as the provident spur to one's own all-important realization. Isn't this what Father saw in Donald Trump? A vision of himself impossibly enhanced, improbably enlarged, released from the pull of debt or truth or history, a man delivered from consequence itself into pure self-absorption, incorporated entirely into the individualist afflatus of American eternity? I think Father was looking for an image of just how much more his American self could contain than the Pakistani one he'd left behind. I think he wanted to know what the limits were. In America, you could have anything, right? Even the presidency. If an idiot like Trump could get a hold of it, couldn't you? Even if you didn't want it? After all, the idiot apparently didn't want it either. He just wanted to know he could have it. Or maybe the emphasis there needs to shift. He wanted to know he could have it. Yes, I think that's right.
It's great. Very timely.
Yeah.
You
hopefully for not much longer.
Yeah. But we're a nonpartisan crowd. Who knows?
Is it? Yeah, I should. Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
You have written in more than just this work about the way in which money and success are kind of coiled amidst the American dream. And I wonder if you could talk about that, talk about your thoughts about that and what you wanted to bring of that to this book.
So one of the stories of the novel, one of the narratives that it tracks is not only the political coming of age of this narrator, but really his rise to success as a writer in America, and how he comes to embody a certain kind of American dream, the dream of his immigrant parents, their son's success. He achieves it as a writer in America. It was a very unusual way of going about it. And the consequences of this, gain him access to a certain elite in the American society, celebrities and the moneyed and Wall Street and all of those foundations and whatnot. And what I felt was essential was to problematize in some fundamental way that the notion that achieving the American dream was a sufficient accomplishment in our era, given the politics of what's happened. That somehow personal success just it didn't matter in the same way. And not just because it was harder to achieve, because yes, it is harder to achieve, but also because the question of me getting mine is fundamentally at root, I believe, of so many of the problems that we're dealing with. The legislation and idealization of individual wealth, the accumulation of individual wealth, the individual success at the expense of the collective, is what I believe in the last 2 generations has led to the widespread disrepair that we now are in. Our national infrastructure has been sold off over 40, 45 years in order to make individuals rich. And becoming rich is the great American story. We as writers don't necessarily always want to acknowledge that, and I don't mean you, I just mean in general as folks of the mind and folks who have other values than material accumulation. In American life, the making of money is the expression of will par excellence, I believe. I mean, that's what I see. That if you want to have relevance in American society, even as an artist, commercial success is the thing that accords that to you. It is not doing great work and being recognized, say, by a cohort of critics or a cohort of deep readers that indicates and marks your influence. So I wanted to problematize that. And one of the ways, so what happens in the book is that the narrator wins a Pulitzer for writing a play and then gets drawn into this foundation, this very, very moneyed hedge fund guy named Riaz Rind, who runs a philanthropic organization that's about changing the conversation about Islam in America and he's really like Sheldon Adelson in some ways for Muslims. The narrator gets caught up in this lifestyle and the consequences are manifold and they result in what later we discover a kind of affliction. But what I was trying to do was to create a space, a discursive and narrative space where some of these conversations could happen authentically and or organically about debt, about finance, about the way that we just talk about universities, American universities, $2.5 trillion in debt, not for students, universities have taken on $2.5 trillion in debt in the last generation and a half. Why? To upgrade facilities, to increase the quality of their faculty. Why? To attract students. Why? To increase cash flow. Why? To take on more debt. Why? To upgrade facilities and et cetera, et cetera. The cycle goes on. And if you look at increases in tuition have matched capital growth, meaning payment on debt. Universities are paying down 4% and 5% on the debt that they're taking out, and they're transferring that tuition raise to students because tuition is not rising in relation to inflation, 1.5%, 2%. It's rising. So debt and finance is at the very heart of what's happening in higher education. And young kids going to, say, Lafayette College have to pay $70,000 a year. They got to take out loans. Stands to reason that they think they should be customers in the classroom. They're paying so much money, they should get what they want. But education is about not knowing what you're getting. And so the hierarchy of pedagogy gets undermined. Why? Because at root, the economics are driving incentive in a different way. That's the real reason it's happening. It's not ideological, or it's only ideological insofar as the economics is ideologically driven. So getting to the root of some of these things as a dramatist, which is something that I've been doing in plays, it was something I wanted to figure out a way to do again, to voice the real in a direct way, but within a narrative structure. I went on for a long time.
No, that was actually fascinating. I mean, I'm obsessed with, the importance of the liberal arts in the academy. So I really agree with you. But one thing that's interesting, I mean, we've just finally learned what our president's tax returns look like. And of course, he's paying very little tax, and he's also, hugely in debt.
Right.
So a lot of what this kind of lust for success as a realization of the American dream also leads to whole new forms of inauthenticity. There to simulate success, because that's how you win. That's how you become president.
That's right. That's right.
So my question, I want to open things up soon to the audience, but where does the writer fit into all this, and where does fiction specifically fit in? And I ask this partly because I am going to be passing the baton of the presidency of PEN America, a literary organization, to you in December, and I'm so excited to have you be our leader. But the vision of PEN America is that writing is of paramount importance to our culture and our democracy, and yet the picture you've described is incredibly scary and discouraging. So talk about what writers can and should do.
It's a good question, and I was asked some form of that question, as you know, in the Times piece, and I sort of said I wish I could answer it as the writer and not the incoming president of PEN, because I'm not sure that I think as somebody who's going to come in to take over an organization started by a group of writers 100 years ago to advocate on behalf of writers who were speaking truth to power, underlying all of that is a belief in the power of the written word and the power of literature to not only voice the actual and voice opposition, voice truth, really, but that process matters and it's relevant and it's socially significant. And some of what I'm suggesting is that this era of economically driven and now algorithmically driven consciousness has rendered literature's calling that much more difficult to fulfill, right? And those two things, I think, have to coexist. I have to coexist inside the competing truths of both things, because I think they're both true. And I do think that literature can matter, does matter, should matter, and will matter. And I think, but at the same time, we have to want to have an appetite to read deeply and to have the ability to sustain our concentration past 140 characters. And we have to, and it may sound facile to put it with, but it isn't. In order to have meaningful public discourse, I think that the core values of literature, emotionally valent and intellectually rigorous discourse, sustained concentration, the ability to brook contradiction, deep reading really is essential to that process. So I think that as an organization, to support writers who want to aspire to participate in the public life of the nation, even sometimes at their peril, and on the other hand, to support an audience of readers who are still committed to the consumption, if you will, although I hate that word, of literature as a meaningful human expression and political expression.
Well, of course, we know that in autocracies, in genuine, dictator-run states, writers are very often imprisoned or even killed for what they write. So there's no question in those environments whether literature has power. Here, we wonder, and I think maybe it's a measure of the degree to which we take our democracy for granted. Yeah,
no, I think that's true. It's true. Masha talks about the autocratic breakthrough, and if we are on the other side of an autocratic breakthrough in the near future, we'll start to understand the importance of being able to speak clearly, truthfully about what's happening to us.
So I think this might be a good moment to open things up. And I can't even see the chat. Okay, there we go. I'm going to let Melanie take over and ask Ed some of your questions.
So our audience is being, I think everybody's just been listening very deeply. So we don't have any questions from the audience yet. But I wanted to, something you were talking about made me think about how this book is kind of an exploration of what's happening in the country, where you have two people in the same family who are on different sides of what's happening at the voting booth, and also people find themselves having difficult conversations with family members about race and these sort of things too. What do you think? I guess, what do you think writing this book about that divide, what has that led you to want to say to people about how to be in a family with somebody who disagrees with you about these very essential beliefs?
Writing the book has taught me nothing about that. I wish that I had some wisdom to convey about that. I think as an artist, probably what I was really trying to do, or was hoping to do, was to take a situation, a series of contraries, a series of oppositions that we're dealing with, that we're working through, one of them being the one you're describing, and to use those oppositions as a conveyor to a kind of absorption in the process of thinking about what's happened to our country. The picture that I'm painting in this book is one in which the heartland has been gutted, in which MBAs have taken over industries they know nothing about. There's a long portrait of the healthcare industry. There's a section about my father in a malpractice lawsuit in Western Wisconsin, being tried by judged by a jury of his peers, mostly white peers in rural Wisconsin. But really what that whole chapter is about the collapse of the healthcare system, and the way in which healthcare is now no longer run by those who actually do the caring. It's run by, and this gap, we're seeing this growing gap between the lords and the masters of the return of 4 to 5%, because that's what's ultimately driving all decision making, is trying to get to 4%. These mountains of money are growing every day, and we're only seeing that now in the pandemic. It's only gotten that much worse. The accumulation of wealth has become that much more concentrated. That money has to continue to grow. That's an existential principle for the society. That's the society we're living in, where the growth of that money is so much more important than anything else. There's another portrait of a glassmaking company in the book, where there's so many changes of ownership that those who are running the company know nothing about blast furnaces anymore. They don't even care. This is the portrait of what's happened to furniture and paper making and tool and die across the country. Healthcare. This is the real problem, because we can't sustain our lives. We have no connection to each other anymore. Everything is mediated by the monetizing imperative. Make money everywhere and in every way. It's an aberration that has taken over our society. And now we valorize it. And now we aspire to become part of it. Making it means being in an American Express commercial, or aspiring to be an Instagram influencer who makes X amount of money for every post. And not casting aspersions on colleagues who do that. This is the incentives. The incentives have shaped themselves in such a way. So what I wanted to do was to portray all of this in as granular and human and relationally vivid, with some hijinks and lots of humor as possible. Because again, getting back to what Jenny was saying, to me, that's what literature can do at its best, is to voice the real, to voice the actual, to show us where we are.
So I do see a question here now, which is very basic, but also one that I have, which is, you've made the point, that you have come at some of these issues as a playwright and now as a fiction writer. What are the differences in it? How would you compare and contrast those two media, those two genres, as a way of doing your work?
Playwriting is so unforgiving. You have to tell the entire story through dialogue. You can't do other things. You've got to tell the story in dialogue. And usually that dialogue is happening between people. Sometimes, in rare instances, if you are skillful enough, you can pull it off that they're speaking to the audience, or maybe they're speaking to themselves. But for the most part, everything that is unfolds narratively in terms of exposition, also in terms of building expectation, in terms of setting up jeopardy, in terms of enlisting empathy on the part of the audience, all that has to happen through the process of the audience observing people and hearing them speak. And so that just limits certain, the audience is going to immediately sense if people are speaking a certain way that they're not really speaking. They're not really talking, the author is talking through them. And I think that one of the things that perhaps a novel can do, a novel is such an extraordinarily hybrid form. I mean, there's a history of so many, I mean, your masterful, your seminal American novel, Goon Squad, which does so many different things. It's so many registers of discourse, so many kinds of valences and articulations and languages that meet. It's like an estuary where all these tributaries can meet. And so I think that the novel gives you more freedom. It's also very unforgiving in a different way. I mean, the performance better be really, really good, because if it's not, the audience is going to pick that up too. They will pick up weakness in a performance of a novel very, very quickly. And sometimes with a play, you can get away with that because your actors are so good that they make your text look a lot better than it maybe really is. But in a novel, there's no, you've got to deliver the goods. So
here's another question. How has coronavirus life positively or negatively affected your writing process, but also crucially, and this evening is testament to that, how you connect with readers? What is it like publishing a book right now?
Oh my God, it's so hard. It's so hard. One of the wonderful things about putting a book out is going across the country, meeting booksellers, meeting audiences, meeting readers, talking to local press, talking to somebody who's, writing an arts column on a weekly basis for the local indie, or doing a radio show that at the university, and sort of getting plugged into the ecosystem, even if it's just for a day, getting the word out, meeting all of these people, and beginning to the process of sharing your work with them. And of course, we do the best we can in this time, but sitting in front of a screen in my living room is a very, very different process of getting the word out. I think I guess the fun part of this is that I get to talk to you, right? If I was doing events, one night in Denver, one night in Seattle, we probably would not have this conversation about the book. We might get together and sort of, we might talk a little bit about it, but we wouldn't have a really in-depth conversation about it. So that's been wonderful, is to have these really, really amazing interlocutors who I admire and have so much affection for, and good friends in some cases, and, for us to be able to talk about the book. But, I have no idea. I guess there are people listening right now, but I only see you on the screens. I don't know.
Guys, I know people. And another question, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but this is a good one. What books are you, and this is actually a question for both of us, what books are we turning to in this moment? And what has, you talked about, on concentration and deep reading. What have you been able to concentrate on at this time?
Well, can I ask you first what you're reading?
Sure. I'm an audiobook addict, and right now I am rereading Toni Morrison on audio because Toni Morrison read her own books, and she is amazing. And having this woman talking into my ear is,
right.
Although these are often very sad sad narratives in certain ways, but so vital. And the combination of the language and her voice is just so great.
Well, that's amazing.
Joy for me.
Yeah, I gotta check that out. I knew that she had read her own books. I remember meeting the guy who had been her engineer for all her books, and he had described the experience of working with her. I'm not reading anything nearly so luminous. I'm reading a lot of Roman history, so I have a lot of social thoughts about what's going on, and those are mostly optimistic and positive. They try to be. And then I have some more private reflections about what's happening, and I see parallels with the crumbling of the Roman Republic, the beginning of the Augustan period, and so I'm on my third biography of Augustus, just trying to make sense of. Yeah, I know I get into these periods of just sort of studying something, and I'm just in it all the time. So my third biography of Augustus, but it's fascinating because Augustus. What's that?
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
It's fascinating because Augustus is the pivotal link. I mean, it's, Caesar represented enough of a decay of the Republic and its ideal that the urge to centralized power, started to manifest in the society, and Caesar represented that. This is a Hegelian reading of the events, but it was not. But the Republic hadn't decayed enough for there to be what Masha calls the autocratic breakthrough, right? And that happened with Augustus, which then led to 200 years of peace and prosperity, which is a very interesting sort of paradox. And so how that happened, why that happened, understanding both the ways in which there is a parallel to be understood and maybe a play to be written about it, or maybe ways in which I'm overcooking the analysis and maybe being led astray by. So all of that's what I'm steeped in right now.
So we are almost out of time, but I think I'm going to ask you one more question. And that arises from my feeling that I find that fiction, good fiction, tends to leave the reader with questions rather than answers. Answers are more the realm of nonfiction and journalism. And one question that I was left with after reading your book that has really stayed with me is, how does one love America now? What is there to love about America now? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I for me, belonging, speaking selfishly, belonging is about locality. I'm not committed to the ideals in the same way that I'm committed to my communities, and committed to my neighbors, or committed to Wisconsin, or committed to Milwaukee Rep, or Penn, or my friends, or those whose lives I engage with and want to make better. And from that concrete thing, maybe abstractions begin to accumulate beyond that. But while I admire the American project, I've never fully bought into the rhetoric. I never, even as a child, and maybe that's because my mom was so at odds with the rhetoric and found it hypocritical in so many ways. So I think it's a wonderful. I love so much about my life. I love so much about the communities that I'm a part of, and that's all America to me. So I think there's a lot for me. There's a lot to love, but love doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to sort of criticize.
All right, I think we are at the end of our time. It has been such a pleasure and a joy to hear you talk about this book.
Likewise. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank
Jenny
you,
and Ed, thank you both. Grab this book if you don't have it yet. Yes. And later, if you find yourself wanting an intelligent conversation about America, you can come back to this page and watch the whole thing all over again. And we're so grateful to all of you, and thanks to our audience for coming tonight. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.